Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics. This show gives you the book club analysis of a tabletop game. Get ready to grab a glass of whatever you like and join us as we do a deep dive on the bizarre origins, the surprising mechanics, and the tiny fine print of games you know or you may never have heard of. Today, I'm your host, Troy. Joining me, as always, is Max, and with us behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about a Chaosium classic, Stormbringer, the first edition.
Yeah, I mean, what can we say about this game? I'm a big fan of the Eternal Champion series, which this is based on. And it's a direct translation with some interesting caveats and treatments of the Michael Moorcock fictional characters from the Elric series. Just to do a little bit of history before we get too far into the discussion. So it was originally purchased by Chaosium for the production of a whole range of Eternal Champions games. It doesn't quite pan out like that. But the first one was in 1977 in producing a Elric board game, which I haven't been able to find too much on, but the cover art looks kind of neat. So, and I'm just curious, as based on what I know about the series, what a Elric board game would even be like. A little later on, it then comes up as a role-playing game. And the fun thing is, so it's based on the RuneQuest rules created by Steve Perrin. And the book itself, the adaptation of those rules, we'll say, is produced by the one and only Ken St. Andre, the creator of Tunnels and Trolls, which we covered a while back. And as I understand it, with a lot of these, we'll call them RuneQuest-esque games, but even by this time, it is referred to as the basic role-playing system, or BRP. It's used as a rule module to then create other themed games, and this is one of them. So most of the writing in this book is St. Andre's work, and they had planned on doing a whole range of other ones. The only one that they were able to make other than Stormbringer was a Hawkmoon game in 1986. Strangely, I wouldn't call this the most popular game by Chaosium in their sort of line of role-playing games, but it's definitely this particular one, Elric, or what will later, in a much later edition, be called Elric, with an exclamation point, is probably the most popular. Like it's certainly hung on for multiple editions. So let's get into the very first one and see what it's made out of.
So this is very reminiscent of basic role-playing, BRP, or what you would find in RuneQuest. It's contemporary. This game has your core attributes. It has nationalities, class. You then have a series of ability bonuses before getting into your skills. So a lot of that will be very familiar to a player who's experienced the BRP verse of rules before, but there are some key differences in Stormbringer that do set it apart from the other BRP products and games.
Yeah, it's important to sort of recognize that, and I hadn't realized this until researching it, that BRP, its very first edition, actually came pretty early in Chaosium's timeline.
Right.
They had mainly focused on a lot of board games originally, and they were ostensibly founded by Steve Perrin to, I guess, produce RuneQuest, which he had originally imagined as a fantasy novel, and then when no one wanted to publish it, he decided to make a game out of it, because that was the other thing he was into. And after playing around with those rules, it became this generic system pretty quickly, and this was one of the first attempts at making something of a different license. So yeah, we've got all your basic attributes that you would have in BRP. I don't think that they're that. No, I don't think there's any difference really.
No, it's the core set. That's right.
Yeah, so it's strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, charisma, power, and size. A lot of these are, I don't know that we've really gotten in deep. The last time we talked about a Chaosium game was Call of Cthulhu, but this is very reminiscent of like even Dungeons and Dragons. Like if anyone who's played pretty well any edition of D&D is going to recognize most of those, with the exception of probably power and size.
That's right.
There's some interesting additions that set it off from RuneQuest, which we actually haven't talked about, but maybe this is a way to kind of hint our way around it before we get there. So with the size, there's an idea in this game that's brought in. So size is a really neat concept. I think this was one of the mechanics that kind of hooked me on the way basic role-playing handles things. So in Dungeons & Dragons, there's this idea of hit dice, that as your character progresses through levels, you roll your hit die and then you get that many more hit points. And it adds a random element, but it does progress the character. In a BRP game, things are more static, and your size combined with your constitution makes up basically what your hit points will be. And that essentially doesn't change. And it creates this, I guess, more of a whole sense of your character. The thing that progresses in basic role-playing are the skills and some abilities and magic, if that's a factor. And the new twist that this game brings in, combined kind of like through the lens of nationalities, which I guess in Dungeons and Dragons as an analog would be race, would be what they call body frame.
Yeah, that's a really interesting mechanic. Body frame is like a general modifier to your character based on where they come from. And the different nationalities, which we'll get into here, will give you a different body frame that is the most predominant frame, or a range of frames for that background. And when you roll on that, it'll help influence and change your ability bonuses that you'll have on your character coming forward.
So size in, say, Call of Cthulhu would just be, oh, there's a set value, and then I roll a few dice and it adds or decreases a few inches to the character, which then have modifiers to predominantly your hit points. But in this game, there's sort of subcategories. I think the broader difference between Stormbringer and RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu is that in Stormbringer, characters are much more larger than life.
Yeah, 100% they are.
Yeah, there's more of a heroic bent to them. I mean, Call of Cthulhu, it makes sense because the horror element comes from the ordinariness of the characters. RuneQuest is just very specifically themed in a kind of alternate history. So the realism is part of the setting to some degree. So that's why they don't like, you can have heroic characters, but it's not the norm per se.
It's something you work towards, less are building from the very get-go. You know, kind of like in Stormbringer, where your stats are just a little bit more elevated than you may see in these other games.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how this pans out with later editions and whether that's more or less emphasized. But in this one, at least comparing other Chaosium games of the same era, this one, I'm not going to call them superhero-esque, but they are very like, they're on the verge of being like a Conan-like character, with a bit of a twist. And Conan is an interesting analog when we get into the lore for describing Elric.
Mm-hmm.
He is kind of an inverted version of Conan.
Yeah, as somebody who hasn't read the series, and this game being my biggest exposure to Elric, the first thing that I noticed was sort of some of the Howardisms and that anti-Conan characteristic that he has.
I don't know that I'd call it a parody, but it has a pastiche kind of quality to pulp literature from the 30s. So yeah, you get your attributes, which are rolled in the sort of standard fashion with the D6s, and some of them have set values like, I think, intelligence, but most of them are just straight rolled. And then you have nationalities, which, as I alluded to before, is kind of the equivalent of picking a human, dwarf, or whatever. But in this case, it's tailored to the specific world. And there are 20 of them. So, not hurting for choice on this. They're all of the New Kingdom, except for Melniboné. Should make a point of that. And they have some interesting effects in the way that they affect your stats.
There's a large number of these different nationalities, and like Ilmoira, for example, will give you a background, a description of who these people are, the basic information, but there really isn't a lot to go off of unless you've engaged with the books and really have an understanding of what these different nationalities mean. Otherwise, you're largely just going to be looking at, mechanically, what's the body frame?
Yeah. And for the most part, it's funny because like I've read most of the Elric series, except for the weird rebirth thing I haven't finished yet. People who read the series will probably know what I'm referring to. I definitely recognize a lot of the nationalities in there, like Pentang being definitely one of those key ones. But there are some in there where I was like, oh, wait, that was like a brief mention in like one story. And so they've taken some liberties with them in the sense that they're trying to fill that out. But any people that have sort of just briefly run over in a story, because the way that we can get into this more later, but the way that Moorcock writes his stories is it's a fantasy world, but it's not in the same way that, say, Howard or Tolkien would write it, where it's very setting based. It's much more character focused, and it's not as much based on a sort of static world, though characters do go back to places and revisit things. So the idea of taking a lot of these nationalities as being, if they feel a bit anecdotal and then somewhat elaborated, that's more Ken St. Andre's sort of creative license working. But I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be the case.
But you mentioned Pantang, right? And just to give an example of how these guys work is it'll first reference sort of like a description of their appearance and their style. It'll then give you a breakdown of how they interpret the religion of the setting and who they worship, if it's like the Lords of Chaos, for example, such as the Pantang. And then there will be an option for you to roll for your body frame, like we were saying. Pantang is just heavy right across. And then it will tell you. So this is something that I kind of glossed over originally, but it's important to note. It'll ask you to add your intelligence and power together. And if it beats a certain value, 32 or more with this nationality, your character is a sorcerer or a priest.
Yeah. So again, there's this sort of stat meets lineage determinism that then opens up into your classes. So I guess we can get into classes. They do have, just as a final point on nationalities, you can play a Melnibonéan, which are the former rulers of the world, so to speak. They're the now withdrawn Roman Empire analog, and as they are wanting to do, they're very much based around being able to have these pacts with elementals and demons and stuff like that, which makes them pretty cool. But I think they're pretty rare. There is a chart for randomly rolling nationality, and I think the odds of getting that one is pretty low. But anyway, onto the classes. So once you've established where you're from and some suggestion about what you might be able to play within that nationality, you then choose your class from among, I guess, the following. So warrior, merchant, sailor, hunter, farmer, priest, noble, thief, beggar, and craftsman. There's also some caveats to both the priest and the beggar, but we can kind of get into that. So Troy, what are your feeling on the class options, and like how exactly do they work?
So there's the basic warrior, merchant, sailor, for example, and then they have modifiers you roll for as a secondary step to determine if you get a special subclass like assassin, trader, shopkeeper, or captain. So there's like these layers of interest that these different classes will have. And when you go into a class, you'll get the following skills and benefits. So there'll be different weapon and combat proficiencies that you'll be receiving, as well as it'll give you other general skills. So for example, if you're going to be a warrior, you're going to get weapon, parry, shield. Your choice of these are going to be given ability bonuses. You'll get a proficiency in a second weapon and shield, and you'll additionally also get bonuses to your ride and agility. You'll have an equal amount of weapons and gear, total to 3. So pieces of armor or weapons of your choice. And that's kind of how the different classes work, is they'll give you the basics of your proficiencies, how your skills get changed, and then what items are included as a basic outline for your character.
Right. Yeah. And so that'll bring us around to those little details between. So with priests, you have to choose a cult that you're part of, and there's a few of these. And this ties pretty closely into magic casting, which is probably the more unique aspect of this game compared to, say, RuneQuest or even Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, I gotta say the magic of this game is my favorite part of it.
It's also very reminiscent of the way magic is handled in the actual stories. They basically put the effort in where it counted, for lack of a better word. When you choose a priest, there's a specific sort of cult, but they essentially align between chaos and law. Strangely enough, and this is something that I didn't notice immediately when reading, Troy, maybe you ran across this. Is there any mention of the balance? Because I don't remember seeing that.
Right.
Because that is an actual belief system. I don't want to call it a faction exactly, but it's an important aspect in the books. And I actually didn't see that as a cult or a playable group. So I thought that was just an interesting thing to point out. But the formation of cult as the structure is very much taken from RuneQuest.
It for sure is. It's such a RuneQuest-ism.
Yeah, it's definitely shaped around the cosmology of the Eternal Champion, especially the Elric series. But mechanically, it's structured exactly the same as RuneQuest.
And you're right. It is just Lords of Law and Lords of Chaos. The balance is not mentioned according to what I'm seeing here.
Now, in all fairness, the balance doesn't have any gods. So maybe that's the argument. I just find it odd that there's no mention of it. The balance has a city. I forgot the name. It escapes me at the moment. But supposedly, law and chaos have no power there. Yeah, I just remember that being kind of a major plot point in the book. But anyway, the other area of difference between some of these backgrounds is with the beggar. And this is probably the more interesting and definitely, I guess, has that old school edge that you probably won't see in a game nowadays. Games are definitely now a lot more focused on balance. But in this, the beggar class is essentially available to anybody who wants to play it. And it's basically playing the game on hard mode.
Yes, 100% it is. Because you're not just beggars. No, you are maimed or diseased.
Yeah.
And that affliction, as it's called, which you get 1d4 rolls on the affliction table. So you're not just one debilitating problem. No, you're a handful.
Yeah.
And you'll make a roll. It's d20. So say we roll 11, you'll be missing 2d4 fingers. And just picture a pre-modern society where you're missing fingers. I mean, any society, like that's going to change your life. And like, wow, that would be such a difficult thing to have your character have to run with in this world.
That is probably due to and again, so weird that they don't have this. They don't have the City of the Balance, but they do have a reference in the mechanics to the City of Beggars, because there's a city that is basically full of these maimed and miscreant people. And it's not necessarily that all beggars come from that one place, but there's this very intentional nod there where I'm like, oh, I know what they're talking about. Interesting. And then they specifically say in the notes under that class that, like, if you're first time playing this game, this is probably not the thing to pick. And I appreciate them pointing that out, but it's interesting that in like a game nowadays, you probably wouldn't have a class that was intentionally harder.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Maybe that wasn't so much of a concern to Saint Andre because he is essentially the father of solo games where that might actually be more interesting. That's just a pet theory. But anything that I've seen that he has had a hand in writing, it's definitely more about the character than about the play experience. And the play experience tailors itself to playing interesting characters.
Yeah.
Which, that is a valid philosophy for role-playing. So I can't fault him on that. But nowadays you see more of this idea that everybody's character is balanced, a little too much sometimes.
Yes.
But it's neat to see that in a game, and it's I don't know that it's a distinctly a Ken St. Andre thing, but I can totally see his style of game fitting in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so then that gets us to another interesting quirk of, I guess, older BRP games in general, but it frames itself out in an interesting way, which is ability bonuses, which might be the big turnoff for playing this edition.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, maybe Troy, you can kind of get into the intricacies of ability bonuses. It's a neat idea.
It is.
But I don't know if it doesn't execute maybe as smoothly as it requires a certain amount of patience that I don't know that a lot of people have.
So this is based off your core attributes, and the average range of attributes is between 9 to 12. So attributes that fall outside of that range will actually give a bonus or a penalty in an increment of a 1% increase or decrease to the relevant ability, like attack ability, parry ability. What's another delightful one? Knowledge ability. So these are all going to be things that are subject to change based on the combination of how is your dex, strength, and size fit together to change how your stealth is calculated, and you'll get your 1 to 3% bonus increase. And it really is so minor and incremental that it feels like, what's the point? And I think that's my criticism of this. But it is interesting because it does, in ways, help to tailor your character. If you're more familiar with Call of Cthulhu from BRP, or from Chaosium, pardon me, you'll be used to the fact that stats have a default score, or skills, I should say, have a default score. And then you can increase that with your skill spending and character creation. In this, you do not have that same default score that you all start from, as that's going to be modified by the ability bonuses. So based on your core attributes alone will change how effective you are at certain things, which ultimately makes a lot of sense. I don't think it's a mistake in terms of analysis. It's more a mistake in terms of implementation, perhaps.
Yeah, it's it makes sense, but I wouldn't call it user friendly.
Yeah.
As you were saying, in Call of Cthulhu, the closest thing to this are when you take your ability scores and then you multiply them by 5, and that becomes a roll, like a raw roll based on whatever that, I'm trying to remember, like you were saying with intelligence, and then that becomes an idea roll.
Oh yeah, 100%.
So that's a more streamlined way of handling that. And I think Sandy Peterson is a bit more straightforward in some of his designs, so that you can see, it's interesting because they're both working in the same framework, but you can see how they solve different things in different ways. And St. Andre doesn't really mind the weird intricacies of these aspects. So the idea that it's ability plus ability, and then there's a derivative that comes from that, I guess that's what his instinct is in designing this. But looking at it, especially because certain attacks sometimes nerf or permanently reduce certain stats, it means that sometimes when you're fighting, you'll have to recalculate.
That's right.
The prospect of that is not like I usually have a lot of patience for pretty noodly games. I'm somebody that's interested, I enjoy reading, Avalon Hill games. But there's a certain amount of especially when you're in the moment and you're in the action, the rules should really try to step aside and be as smooth as possible so that you don't derail what's happening. And when we get into combat stances and combat sequence, that will kind of rear its head again. But I think, Troy, because you've had more experience with the RuneQuest system, you might be able to shine a bit more light on that. But we'll get there after we get through the rest of the character.
And skills, they come to you determined by your class, as well as D6 plus bonus roll. This will be basically your starting allotment of skills for your character and what you're going to really start your build based off of. The starting skill values like we were just saying, are subject to the attribute modifiers of your ability bonuses. So it's going to give you some texture to your character at the cost of a little bit of complexity. And then you will fill out your skill sheet. Anyone who has done RuneQuest will be right at home here. And once you've got this basically created, that is your character. That's character creation. You've got attributes, your ability bonuses, your skills. We've got your nationality, your class background. So all of that together will fill out the sheet, the character sheet of this game, which is not that bad. It's a pretty easy document to go over. It is BRP ultimately. And then with that, we get into sort of the core skeletal rules of the game system.
Just one point about the skills before we exit that. This game, probably because of when it was made, suffers from a amusing level of skill bloat.
Oh, that's a good point.
It is a skill-based game, which I wouldn't say is necessarily a new concept at the time that this came out, but BRP kind of established the way that you do that, so that characters are less based on their class and origins as a framework for character development, and it's more about the progression of gaining new skills and improving things. But yeah, there's so many specific skills, like juggling is a skill.
I love that.
There's different lores that are like plant lore, music lore, map making, memorize, which is kind of an attribute of intelligence. I can see how some of these are directly taken from the books, but there seem to be way more skills that might actually be necessary.
Yeah.
And there might be missing a few that, like, you know, like there's perception skills, and they're like, these are interesting because I don't think you see these in other games, but like see, listen, scent, taste, balance, search, track. They're literally like skills based around sensory perception. I've seen that taken into games, but like, it's just strange, the idea that like, yeah, I'm just going to put scent up till I turn into a human dog.
Yeah.
Like, usually that's a special thing because human beings aren't usually that good, but at smelling things, so to speak, or taste. How detailed could that get?
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring up the fact that there's a lot of very specific skills, and it's not the only game that I can think of that has a challenging time balancing what is too many and too few. But yeah, on to the I guess the meat of the game, which is it's an adventure game, so combat is a central component of the entire experience.
Yeah, it's movement and combat are the next two big things to cover. And the movement rules will give you information for long distance travel and sort of more of this out of combat narrative time, however you want to contextualize it, long distance journeying. And then there's also combat distances with terrain modifiers and a very tactical level of detail.
Mm-hmm. It's a very tight game at times. I'm not talking like GURPS tight. It's not down to the second, but it's fairly specific as to like what you do and how that plays out. And so that comes together in the combat sequence. This is interesting because there's definitely wargame-isms in the combat sequence that it's not as though they're unheard of in role-playing. In fact, they might even make a more interesting role-playing experience in some cases. But nowadays, you wouldn't see a lot of these things. So the initiative is based on dexterity.
Yeah.
So the highest dex goes first. I don't think it's even suggested that they roll. It's just whatever the stat is.
Yeah, very straightforward.
And then based on that, everyone declares their actions, which is very much like a war game or a skirmish game. Not every one of them, but there's a lot of one where essentially there's a series of declarative statements of what people are going to do, and then combat actions resolve. And both melee and range, if you're in contact with an opponent, it's assumed that you're doing a melee attack, and if you're not, and you declare yourself attacking with a ranged weapon, then that happens.
And all of this is vaguely familiar to the sister game RuneQuest, is it not? With how strike ranks work.
Yeah. If you want to get into strike ranks, it's funny because this game, despite being larger than life and being maybe more specific than RuneQuest, actually has a simpler version of strike ranks in it. And then also suggests that you can use strike ranks from RuneQuest in the book.
And just to give a little bit of information, how strike ranks work, what they are, is It's a way in which you would track initiative without basing it on a dexterity stat, but instead basing it on the actions each participant of the fight takes. So if you were to unholster your bow, draw an arrow, and fire, that would add up to a certain strike rank value. And that's where you would find yourself in the initiative sequence of that round. So in this, you still declare your actions like at the top of the turn, similar to strike ranks, but it just goes on dex. It doesn't base it on your specific actions you're taking, adding up to a value that would then determine your initiative sequence. However, as Max said, that's just stated in the rulebook. Hey, if you have a copy of RuneQuest, turn it open and go to that chapter and use that instead. So it's there for you if you'd like to use that as an option. But I do like this because it is just dex coming off your core attributes, and it allows you to have that tactical interplay of, I'm going to declare my actions in front of seeing the outcome. So you don't know exactly where everyone's going to fall unless you are, counting the cards in your head, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I understand strike ranks are basically there as it's a really interesting and logical way to track time and action in a combat, but it can be weighty on the game master for tracking that and making sure that, like, when initiative is established at the beginning of the round, that you know who is doing the more challenging and involved things. And it's a sacrifice of bookkeeping versus tactical detail, but it's nice that there's a lighter version of that, considering that there are other aspects of it that are a little bit more involved. And then, yeah, after combat actions are settled, whatever way you end up choosing to do that, any character that hasn't declared, or I suppose in the declarative statement is declared that they're going to move, now makes their move actions. And that's about as simple as it assumes. I don't think there's anything about different speeds or approaches.
That's right, yeah.
You basically say you're going to go from here to there, and it's a set distance. And then finally, I guess magic or special effects are resolved. So if somebody was declared they were casting a spell, and it went off that turn, it would go off at the end of that round. And that's very reminiscent of, like, war games, especially some editions of, say, Warhammer.
Yeah, where there's like almost a separate magic phase that occurs.
Yeah, and there's some sense of that because we'd imagine that magic is a more involved kind of thing. From that point, we can get into how weapons and armor work. So in the sense of a lot of BRP games from this, it's a D100 based system. So that's important to keep in mind if you don't know already. So that's where you take percentile dice and then you try to roll under the target. But when it comes to weapons and equipment, these use varied polyhedrals that you'd see in Dungeons & Dragons. So D4s, D6s, D8s, sometimes a number plus or minus a number, and then usually combined with a value or an additional die, in fact, based on a hit bonus, which is strength based. Other than that, weapons are fairly simple, as far as I could see.
Yeah, they'll have a required strength and dexterity, and then they'll just give you their damage. 1d6 plus 2 if you have a falchion, for example, right? So it is very standard for fantasy roleplay how the weapons are outlined in this. But I think that's almost a strength because people who might be coming to this from some of the other fantasy roleplay properties, this is a core part of the game. It works similarly to what you're used to. It's kind of like using a 4 or higher on a d6 in a war game. It's like everyone knows how that works. So when we get to the things we're doing differently, people still have the brain space to process them, as opposed to like reinventing the wheel at every step.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the alternate way that you usually see requirements for weapons are in a class-based system. They usually have what's sometimes loosely referred to as licenses. So only fighters can use big swords. In this case, because it's skill-based, it's more of a requirement. Armor is not like the outlier of BRP to Dungeons and Dragons. One of the mechanics is how armor works, which is arguably makes more sense, but is a little bit more math heavy. So armor is absorbative. It has an encumbrance rating, and essentially when damage is dealt, a value based on the armor's strength reduces the damage coming in, which is probably more accurate to how armor works. When we get to our AD&D episode, I can go into a whole bunch of detail about why armor class is the way that it is in D&D. But for our purposes here, this is one of the distinguishing factors of this game and all other BRP and Chaosium games, is that it has a deductive armor system, which is probably more common, at least from what I've seen in rules. And then we get to the special sauce of this game, which is how it handles magic.
Yeah, that's easily the most compelling part of this book and really gives you insight into the setting as well.
Yeah, I do think that there's some missed opportunities, but from what there is, it's very much tied into the that's the most thematically accurate and detailed part of the entire thing. So I guess we just get into some of the basic concepts. All right. Firstly, magic in this game is chaotic by nature. Magic is messing with reality. So thematically, it makes perfect sense to be able to reinterpret elements and summon power from potential, I guess is sometimes how it's referred to in the books.
And it's important to note that, like, this is something, as someone who didn't know Elric, you don't cast a spell like the spell is some inert concoction that you make. It's actually a thing that you have summoned, such as a demon or an elemental, and it is serving the purpose of your spell. So if you were to, I don't know, Max, maybe you can correct me here, but if you wanted to shoot a fireball, if that's even a thing, to make a D&D reference, you wouldn't just shoot a ball of flame. It would actually be a lesser elemental that you've summoned, a fire elemental.
Yeah, so there's a few ways to do it, and the rules certainly support this. So magic is done through intermediaries and patrons. And it's not the only system to do this, but it's definitely, this is where that concept originates from these books. I mean, not exactly. There's probably pulp stories and stuff where people summon monsters and demons for fantastic powers. But as far as having a system of magic based around it, Elric is kind of where that idea gets really fleshed out. So, yeah, like you were saying, Troy, if you wanted to cast a fireball, let's say, you would summon the power of probably a fire elemental, also called a salamander. In the books, you'd probably literally talk to it and like negotiate it into doing something. And it probably wouldn't be a fireball so much as just the salamander directly attacking your opponent, but it's also just made out of fire, so the effect is almost the same.
Right, totally.
Yeah, so the other way that is sometimes handled in the stories, and it's also supported in the rules, is that elementals and even demons can be bound to objects. The example of Stormbringer itself is, well, I don't know that it is a demon separate. I don't think that came up in the story, but it has a demonic force inside it that makes it powerful, and in the case of Elric as a character, allows him to drain the life from people he kills.
And that is probably this is going to sound kind of dumb, the quote safest way to summon a demon and use them is to bring them in a safe environment, because it does take time to perform a summoning and to get them into a marked object. By doing so, you can then more safely call upon that power when you need it, as opposed to try and perform some elaborate summoning, under duress or something.
I mean, it works out for Elric, because Elric has these really great established relationships with elementals and Arioch specifically. He makes some dealings with other demons, but his patron deity is Arioch, which is one of the ones you can certainly align yourself with in this game. But yeah, having like a ring of salamander or the other elemental types, so sylphs, undines, and gnomes. Yes. So sylphs are air, undines are water, gnomes are earth, and salamanders are fire. So a ring of salamander could allow you to just fling a fireball with point and shoot. And you're right, that is like the more reliable, safe. In fact, there's not a lot of reference in the stories to New Kingdom people using magic. There's a few notable sorcerers, certainly, but in some cases, people have like elemental utilities that they can access, like magic rings, magic swords, your usual fantasy gear.
Yeah.
And then as you build up in power in this game, you can summon bigger things. You can do more. You can get more out of these beings, so you can have them ward or fight directly. You can create dimensional gates
Through demons of travel. Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, the demons of travel are neat. Yeah, so demons represent more of these sort of abstracted concepts and not so much elemental forces.
Like combat, protection, knowledge, some of these like more themes than elemental theories or whatever. And with demons of combat, like you can summon in a weapon.
You can summon in a weapon directly, or presumably you can bind a demon of combat to an existing weapon, which would make the weapon more powerful. So that essentially gets, and the portal traveling part is a big part of the multiverse aspect of the Eternal Champion series. So there's definitely a lot of justifications for traveling to like other realities. And I haven't looked at the Hawkmoon book, but it probably ties into the weird world of Hawkmoon, which is presumably a different or further timeline than the Elric series. And then the highest beings that you can tap into are elemental rulers, and there's 4 of those, 1 for each element. So it's literally the king of all of that element. Beast lords, which are kind of like animal nature or plant nature, but taken to its like most extreme. And I think they're specifically around a kind of animal, but I don't know that the book here specifically says that. And then there's the Lords of Law and Chaos. The one missed opportunity is there's not really any reference to the Lords of Law doing anything specific, when I'm pretty sure that in the books, a good example of this is the inscription in the later parts of the story that Moonglum has. So there's a character named Moonglum who's a friend of Elric. He has an inscription of law on his sword that makes him better at fighting chaotic things. There's no real reference to that here.
Right. That is a bit of an opportunity that they should have capitalized on, to have some contrasting powers to how much focus that chaos gets.
Yeah, because I understand the idea that like manipulating and sorcery creates these kind of, these effects. And I guess the argument they make is, well, law is status quo, but the power of law is to maintain the status quo. So when I was getting into this, I was expecting more of like protection wards or defending things or things that like freeze things as they are, or even just enchanted weapons that kill chaos. You could house rule that, but it would have been nice to see something that was like you could make pacts with law, because there are characters in the books that do that. I mean, even Elric summons the gods of law at one point. I feel like that was maybe a missed opportunity that when checking out future editions of this, I'm hoping will make an appearance. But yeah, that was my only gripe about the system. But otherwise, the system does a really great job of playing with this idea of chaotic forces and making contracts with these intermediary beings. Or in the case of lesser elementals, you just get, they're almost animalistic sort of forces of nature you can fling at your opponent. I mean, what was your take, being someone who's not as familiar with the lore?
I just love how magic is not another flavor of this Vancian casting system we see in so many games, that it is a specifically bespoke and unique casting system based on the setting that has the real narrative pitfalls. I'm a big narrative gamer. I don't play to win. I play to see what happens.
Yeah.
And what I like is that you can summon a demon and it can rip your face off.
Oh, yeah.
Your best laid plans can completely get sidetracked by the summoning that was key to that very plan. So it just creates some really cool potential for storytelling. I think the contrast between the 8-pointed star of chaos and the triangle of law is really dramatic and cool. And being able to increase your stats by summoning and binding elementals and demons is just awesome. So I'm a big fan of how this works. I'm more familiar with traditional casting methods. But then again, I'm someone who always avoids casters because a lot of the time it's just a bunch of added complexity. And this actually seems like it'd be fun to do.
Yeah, and because it's a skill-based game, though certainly priests have the advantage in this case, you could work your way up to learning some of these as any other kind of class. Though obviously you would need an in-game reason to have the right skills to do it. And we can get into, let's get into the parts where we kind of tie into that. So there are cults that you can align yourself with, Young Kingdom cults. And then there's this force called Elan, which is essentially your divine status, for lack of a better word. It's how well recognized you are by otherworldly beings. And it is a direct power modifier to whatever you're casting. As you build up, you can then bring in more safely I think the risk factor of bringing in more superior and powerful beings into play or contacting them in any other way is still risky, but it's at least possible if your status as a caster builds up. And being part of a cult means essentially having a doctrine that puts you along building that up. And that's mainly for priests, but they didn't see any reason why it was exclusive. And the only other element is that you then probably carry the trappings or amulet of that cult.
And anyone can become an agent of a deity. It's only a priest that joins like the cult in that proper sense, but any other character can be an agent, and then they would, for example, have an amulet representing their choice that they would keep on their character, as a symbol of their devotion or loyalty.
Yeah. And I can see how this mechanical approach was then taken into the Dungeon Crawl Classics handling of sorcery, more or less, because it does denote that though the priest is the one that has the summoning spell for whatever weird patron that you're going to end up summoning, you can summon it on the behalf of another character who can then make a pact with them.
Right on.
There's definitely an influence of this that I wasn't aware of, because I'm a big fan of DCC, and I was like, oh, that's really, I like, the thing that I like about Dungeon Crawl Classics is how playful and plastic it is, but it's also getting its ideas from a lot of these sort of more novel reach of games, and I kind of see some of that here.
That's really cool. Yeah, I agree.
And then, we've got finally at the end, we've got a Game Master section, which is sort of a hints and tips.
And the Game Master chapter, it effectively amounts to hints. It's not as detailed as you may find in some guides, but it essentially focuses on the struggle between law and chaos and says, do that. It doesn't really tell you how to do that, but it definitely indicates that that is the underlying thematic element that will make your games feel like they are set in the Young Kingdoms. It does have suggestions on gaming before and during the time of Elric, and it even gets a little bit crazy for me by suggesting that you play not only with named characters, but you recreate them statistically and play as named characters in your own stories, which is a little out there. I mean, for me, I want to tell my story, so it would be a little strange to take someone else's character. However, many games, especially contemporary war games, are like special character fighting games. So, I mean, there's definitely an appeal to that to a lot of players. So I can see what's going on here. But they do talk about specifically in this Game Master chapter that player characters are more powerful than your standard fare. So they will give you an indication of maybe think about what these people are capable of when you're doing your encounter design, when you're thinking of your combats, because they might be able to outpace a familiar character that comes from basic role playing, for example.
Yeah.
Like you get 1d10 stat increase when you are increasing your skills as opposed to 1d6. And that's not a lot. I mean, it's not a huge difference, but it is a difference. And that'll start to make itself known, as players progressively make more of those advancements.
Yeah. I mean, it's also a probable difference. You could technically roll the same thing. But for a game that supposedly is a bit more larger than life, it definitely emphasizes that to play these more notable characters.
And it's a sword and sorcery game. So it expresses to you, get into the action quickly.
Yeah.
Have brief preparation, have a setup, establishing scene, for example, but you want to be into the action. This isn't a really overly pensive gamer experience compared to, say, a more investigative Call of Cthulhu, or really like rich cultural exploration like RuneQuest. This is more sword and sorcery. There's a sword in your hand, a torch in your other hand, and you're fighting something. So it even makes a reference specifically. This is a quote: "When the character's number comes up, kill him without regret." So, like, it's not pulling punches on either side.
That's a fair assessment. A lot of the themes in the Elric story have to do with the death of a character, like a lot of those punctuated moments.
Right.
So if you really want to stick to the theme, it makes sense to kind of make it harrowing and a bit dicey. You want your characters to, if you're really playing to that theme, you want them to feel like they've been through something, and if you have to kill them to make that point, then that's what they're suggesting. Again, not a very modern way of thinking about it. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the thing that you want to avoid is a meaningless death, because I can't think of a single character except for some of the minions in Elric that just die arbitrarily. Yeah, because even the villains are like, there's a certain amount of surprise and even pathos in some cases, where you're like, oh wow, he was a tragic character and then Elric sucked his soul out. And maybe that was deserved, but you kind of felt that Elric was doing a questionable thing by doing that. It would help. I mean, it's interesting that this Game Master section is so short, because at the beginning of the book, there's essentially an entire synopsis of like Moorcock's writing the entire Elric arc, like the main arc of the story, and like background information. So it essentially is like a full-on spoiler for the books. So if you don't care about reading the books and you want the short version, it's in there. I definitely recommend reading the books because you get more of the feeling. At least a few of them.
Well, and they're very foundational too. They set the tone of a lot of fantasy to come after it. Like this whole presence of chaos and this risk of using magic. I mean, like Warhammer takes that and runs with it.
Well, I mean, Warhammer took the chaos symbol wholesale.
They did. Yeah, they just sort of copy and pasted that one.
Yeah, I mean, Moorcock didn't do anything to stop them. He did mention that it was cheeky that they did that. But yeah, also, just as a note while we're on the topic, the way the symbol of law is described here is not how it's described in the book. It's not a triangle, it's an arrow. But you could see how a triangle being like the simplest number of lines to make a solid shape. I'm fully on board with the way they describe it.
Yeah.
But the idea it being contrary to the chaos symbol, which is 8 arrows pointing in different directions, versus 1 arrow pointing one direction, does make a little more sense.
Oh, I understand what you mean. Okay, that's cool.
I like their interpretation. I think that's a cool one. I certainly get the metaphysic of it. But yeah, it's just interesting how that was a little different. And then, yeah, at the very end of this, there's a scenario.
Yeah, it's the playtest scenario.
Yeah, which is interesting that it's a playtest scenario, but it gets you to how not only something to play, but how the game is played, because it serves as something like an example. And so, briefly touching on the lore, I mean, I would really just recommend picking up the books. They are some of the best fantasy stories. It's certainly of an era. It's definitely that late 60s, early 70s, even late 70s sort of psychedelic fantasy. If you're somebody that likes the concrete meat and potatoes of Tolkien, this is probably a big departure from that. It also has a sort of bleak cynicism about it that even the Conan stories don't really go into. And yeah, I'm going to sort of give you the theming of it very simply. Elric is a kind of inverted Conan character. So where Conan is somebody that struggles his way up to become king, even though the very first story of Conan has him as king. Ignoring that, Elric starts off as the inherent ruler of a decadent empire that is now in its decline. He then proceeds to leave that in order to discover himself after having a sort of misadventure with one of his rival cousins for the throne, who he then leaves in charge of that throne, goes out, discovers that not only his cousin, but the entire remains of the empire can't be trusted in those hands, and then decides to destroy his own empire. And that's like the main arc. Instead of, rescuing the princess, he's already married to her, and then she dies at his own hands. Sorry, this is definitely spoiler territory.
I mean, these books did come out like 60 years ago.
I know, yeah. And it's literally in the beginning of the synopsis to this role-playing game. So, you're not... I hope you will read these things, but yes, there's this element. And then Elric then goes on a series of misadventures in an attempt to thwart chaos, and then ends up destroying everything. So, yeah, in that is packed the themes. And it's actually interesting that they do mention playing before and after Elric, though playing after Elric is... You'd have to have read those books to know how that would work. But playing before Elric is definitely a good suggestion, because the time Elric exists is only like a few years.
And a few years of chaos and change.
Yeah, when he leaves the throne and like actively eliminating like entire cities or really key players, or in some case, dethroning or killing gods. So it's definitely epic, cool stuff. And it's written really, really well. Like Moorcock is a very accomplished wordsmith. So absolutely do read it, even just for that. But yeah, the world is interesting. And the fact that it's the Young Kingdoms basically means that you're the background players. You're all the places that Elric visits. Like, your character will be from those places. And they're kind of neat. They're like an odd combination of East meets West. So there's a lot of deserts come up a lot. There's a lot of Arabian Night kind of themes that run through some of the early stories. And they can extend into some quasi-medieval fantasy. I think, unlike RuneQuest, which is more ostensibly a sword and sandals Bronze Age, this is more of a surrealist medieval setting.
Right.
Notably, I don't think I saw any crossbows, because actually, if I remember, I don't remember there being any in the books. But they do have bow and arrows. They definitely have weapons that you don't need to bend back into shape after misuse.
Yeah.
Or even regular use. Yeah, that's a fun historical fact about soft metal.
Yeah, it's not like Egyptian or Sumerian armies.
Yeah, right. I don't even remember how that plays out in RuneQuest, but that's definitely a thing. And it's a unique fantasy setting, but you could just play it with the assumption that it's Fantasyland. But you're probably going to get more out of it if you really dig into the specific vibe that it's going for.
Yeah.
That's basically the lore in a nutshell. But yeah, I would really encourage people to explore the stories. Yeah, and so what are our takeaways? Oh, I make a note about the printing of this book. There's some beautiful art in it, and it is well laid out. It's good printing quality, especially. I mean, when you get into the 80s, that's when the quality of these things starts to improve quite a lot.
Yes.
You get that professional, printing layout. There's some good graphs. There's not, despite the fact that the art is really nice in this book, there's not that much of it.
It's a lot of text. That's right.
That was a bit of a letdown, but then it's hard. I mean, there was a comic of Elric, comic adaptation, and there's a few other things. Maybe it's the nature of the writing, but I don't see as much art for it as I do for other fantasy stories. It's certainly out there, but as an illustrator myself, there is an intimidating quality about painting these really like acid drenched like fantasy battle scenes and stuff like that, and you're like, where do you even start? I think that was maybe a bit of a letdown, is that it was a little thin on art. But yeah, final thoughts?
I am intrigued to read the series, especially after seeing what this does for other fantasy that I've engaged with so much already. And man, that magic system, like we've talked about extensively, is just so cool.
Yeah, it feels very role-playing-esque magic, where like I'm not just flicking a spell at you. It's, you know, I have to negotiate somewhat for that spell.
Yeah, spells aren't guns. I love that.
Yeah. I think that that's really how Magic ought to feel if you really want to make it feel not like sci-fi.
Yeah.
Like if you want to avoid that interchange between ray guns and wands.
I absolutely agree. Like magic and technology can both achieve the same end, but how they get there should feel very different.
100%. So that'll conclude it for this episode, and come back again for the next one where we're going to be discussing laser burn, which is, Troy, how would you explain laser burn?
Ooh, that's a foundational early sci-fi skirmish game. This lays the groundwork for a lot of miniature games that are going to come after it.
Yes, especially those by the writer's eventual company, which is Games Workshop.
100%.
Tune in then, and we hope to know that you're listening. And please feel free to reach out to us. Our information will be played at the end of the episode. Thank you. And happy gaming.
Have a good one.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.